morning, good afternoon, good night. I don't know when you're watching this. My name is Gabriel Andrade, and today I'm gonna talk a little bit about neuropsychology of bilingualism. I work with psychology, research, statistical data analysis. I usually in Guarapuava, either in Guarapuava or in Curitiba, at Incorpore, Instituto de Saúde, and Caminhar Centro de Apoio. I'm also a member of the Psychology of Bilingualism Lab of Plínio, Toni, and I'm also a co-host at the podcast Café com Neuropsicologia. I would like to thank Professor Plínio for inviting me here, and so I could teach a class here at the Doctorate at the subject of bilingualism in the Doctorate program of Community Development of the Midwestern State University of Paraná. It's a great honor, and I'm very excited about it, and I hope you all enjoy it. And okay, so let's get into it. Just for starters, I would like to talk about neuroplasticity, which is how the brain can change, even in adulthood, due to experience. This whole idea was kind of frowned upon some decades ago, but today we know that the simplest of things can actually change our brain. And actually, it probably wouldn't be possible to have psychotherapy and neuropsychological rehabilitation, for example, if there weren't for neuroplasticity. It would allow only for compensatory methods. So I brought this example just for you to see how really anything can promote this. And this study from 2004 was related to juggling, like doing things like this. I don't really know how to do it, but they got people just like me who couldn't do it, who didn't know how to do it, and analyzed their brains. And after they were good at doing that, after they managed to do it for a certain amount of time, they analyzed their brains again, and they found a volumetric increase in the occipital lobes. Of course, there's a lot of examples. Music players, the study on the London taxi drivers, and education, and lots of other things. But I'm going to explain why bilingualism has to do with that as well. And it's mostly related to joint activation theory. The idea that you have both languages active at the same time. It sounds a little crazy, but there is evidence for that. It's not just a crazy idea. Even clinical evidence, like if you damage the areas related to inhibition, especially the anterior cingulate cortex, you're going to have a hard time picking which language you're going to speak, or maybe sometimes the undesired language at the time is going to drop by in the conversation. We also have neuroimaging evidence, and of course behavioral evidence. That's the case. We could cite also the predictive systems in linguistics, like how people that speak as a first language the language X, and they're going to learn the language Y. And usually they make mistakes that are kind of similar with the others that come from this context, this background of language X. Of course, it changes a lot from individual to individual, and lots of other variables involved in that as well. If it's incidental teaching, if it's actual classes, if it's mostly declarative of or procedural training, but yeah, it's kind of predictable. And also accent. You could say that accent itself is a proof that at least the first language influences the second. And it happens in kind of similar ways, because not like everybody has a different accent. There are some kinds of accents related to the first language that you learn. Of course, some people from abroad, from other countries, kind of disagree. They don't say it's easy to identify somebody as Brazilian because of their accent. But at least to me, I know a lot of people in Brazil who speak English, and I noticed that they have some kind of similar accent, a similar way of speaking, and yeah, of course, and this joint activation theory that implies that both languages are active at the same time also implies something. We do speak at one language. We can't speak at two languages at the same time. So there has to be some mechanism in which we pick the appropriate language and don't use the other one, don't let the other one interfere. And the connections related to that, mostly conflict resolution, inhibition, and flexibility, are strengthened by bilingualism, because it's kind of like an exercise. I really like to use this analogy, but it's not exactly like that, but it's a nice analogy to be used, I guess. When you're in a gym, for example, and you are used to lifting 10 kilos every day, you don't really feel that lifting 10 kilos is hard anymore, because you're used to that. So you start lifting 15, for example. And if you're not used to that, for the first time, it's gonna be a little heavy. But eventually you're gonna get used to that. And when you get to this point that you're used to that, your muscles increase in response. They get strengthened to accommodate this new demand that you have. And in the brain, it's kind of like that. There are some functions that when you put higher demand on them, not all functions work like that, but mostly have some kind of change, at least to some degree, but in relation to executive functions, they do have a lot of plasticity. And when you put a lot of demand on your executive functions, you actually have to accommodate this experience until you get used to it. So you strengthen your brain, the connections related to that, maybe the areas related to that, either white or gray matter, so you can so you can do it in a more easy manner. So just for me to explain, these functions that I'm talking about, these other functions, are the functions related to planning, executing, monitoring complex behaviors that are like goal-driven. And Diamond divides it in inhibitor control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. There are actually studies on all of this, but we are focusing mostly in inhibition, where most studies in bilingualism are made, because of the idea of the joint activation. So when you do it like this, by being you exercise your brain by being bilingual, you actually have an increase in your volume in the anterior cingulate, this area right here, in the frontal lobe. And this area is mostly related to inhibition. And being the frontal lobe associated with declarative knowledge, like when you have a higher demand of things when something is new, you're not used to doing that, you have a higher demand of the frontal lobes. But eventually there's a switch. It kind of increases in volume, but eventually when you get in a certain level of proficiency, it goes down again, and areas in the basal ganglia, in the medial portions of the brain, have an increase in volume, because you have like a certain demand of the declarative memories, but when you're practicing, you actually create procedural knowledge, and eventually you get like to a point where it's more procedural than declarative, even though it never gets to a point that it's 100% one or the other. Just like the demand from one overcomes the demand from the other, and that's observable in volumetric studies on the brain, the bilingual brain. So the basal ganglia, there are some areas in the basal ganglia that actually get a little bigger in volume, and of course, being the basal ganglia related to procedural knowledge, to automatic movement, to things like that. So you get used to picking the right language, and then it gets easier to do that. But you still have to do a higher demand than, say, a monolingual, if you compare like peers that only have bilingualism to differ. And in our reviews, you're going to notice that I have some unpublished ones here. Since this is a presentation about the stuff that I have been studying since I started in this field around 2016, 2016, I have some papers that weren't published yet. They are all waiting for a peer review, except for one that I didn't finish. But I'm gonna just use this data because they were collected from, they were either presented at congresses or approved as a scientific initiation project, or there has been some kind of peer review, even though they weren't published. But they are, hopefully they're gonna be published soon. Okay, so in the studies, in our reviews, we went for Brazilian studies in the last 14 years, and studies by Ellen Bialystok, because she is one of the greatest, maybe the greatest researcher in this field of neuropsychology of bilingualism. And her studies were from the last 7 years for children and older adults, but for only 4 years for adults still, because I'm still doing this review. It's kind of preliminary research studies. I mean. Okay, so both in Brazilian and Canadian studies, we have found that neuropsychological tests applied on children usually show this difference, like of a bilingual advantage in executive functions. Usually executive control, like being able to inhibit something, to control your executive functions. And in relation to adults, there's some evidence, but the results are often mixed. Usually there are more studies that don't find this difference than studies that find it. At least in our reviews that we focus on studies by Ellen Bialystok and by the Brazilian researchers. Although it's a little hard to find a behavioral difference, sometimes the same study is combined with neuropsychological measurement. Neurophysiological measurement. And in neurophysiology, it's common to find a difference. Every single study that we found from in these reviews, we found there was a significant difference. And so what does that mean? Either the participants are too good, or the test is too easy for them, or maybe it's a very specific advantage that when you're actually going to do something, it gets covered by other functions. So it doesn't let for these people to be differentiated. Even though there are some studies, of course, that have found this difference. Just want to make this disclaimer here. And as of older adults, the evidence is also mixed on behavioral data, but the majority of studies find evidence for cognitive reserve. I'm gonna go back to that later. But cognitive reserve is basically postponing symptoms or keeping functionality even throughout an older age. Yeah, I'm gonna go back to that. Okay, so we have talked about executive this, executive that, executive control, executive functions, but what about the other functions? In relation to IQ, even though executive functions are parts of the IQ examination, of the intelligence batteries, there's actually no evidence on a different IQ between bilinguals and monolinguals. There are some people who insist that bilinguals are smarter. In the past, people believed that bilinguals were less intelligent, but that's not exactly the case, at least from the studies that we have seen and the reviews that we have read. There's also a monolingual advantage for vocabulary, and it's probably because of exposition. I'm sorry I put exposition here, but it's actually supposed to be only here. The idea is that monolinguals are exposed 100% of the time to their first language, but bilinguals have to divide their time naturally to receive input from both languages. So they develop a smaller vocabulary in their first language. In relation to working memory, even though it's a part of executive functions and is an aspect of executive functions, we don't really know about it, the relation. There are a lot of studies, but some of them find this different, some of them don't. But it's much less frequent finding this difference than, say, for executive functions. In our studies, in our reviews, we didn't find that there was no difference between the groups in the studies done in Brazil. But for the studies done in Canada, there was actually the sample size. I mean, not exactly a sample. The size of the review itself, like the number of papers that we reviewed, was not very big. It was not big enough, and it wasn't focused on working memory. So we can't really say that's a strong evidence, but we did find some sort of tendency towards working memory tests that are verbal, resulting in a monolingual advantage, and working memory tests that are non-verbal, resulting in a bilingual advantage. And this would be mostly explained if it really is the case, and we don't really know, if it really is the case that monolinguals might be better in non-verbal contexts with a higher demand of executive functions, and monolinguals have an advantage in verbal contexts. Okay, so in relation to delaying gratifications, could also be related to executive functions, to inhibition, but to some other kind, maybe. As I mentioned, inhibition is a complex function. Executive functions are complex. You can't really say that's one function. It's a lot of functions together, that result in the capacity of inhibiting things. And in delaying gratification, such as the marshmallow test, for example, there is no evidence of a difference between bilinguals and monolinguals. Maybe that happens because this specific context is very different than the one promoted by bilingualism, which involves conflict monitoring. They have to monitor conflict and pay attention to one language and inhibit the other. So it's not really the same as a marshmallow test. And the study is in Brazil that was done by Seco and colleagues from our lab, which I gladly helped out on doing. We studied as I mentioned, we studied the last 14 years, and looking specifically for executive functions and bilingualism, and we didn't find any studies from 2003 to 2008. At least any data collection studies. There were some reviews, and considering all these 14 years, there were only 10 data collections, and they had a lot of variations in methodology. Most studies were from Rio Grande do Sul, so I guess they're the most experienced ones in this field in Brazil, and they had a lot of variations in methodology. So some studies were very rigid, methodologically speaking, like they had a high control of socioeconomic status and education and the city, and used questionnaires to quantify bilingualism, not only dividing them in groups, not only using like a pure self-identification as bilingual or monolingual, but some of them didn't really explain how they categorized. Some of them didn't really control for socioeconomic status or education, or which city the people are in, which country they are from, and thus it makes it a little hard to interpret some of these studies, even though there are some of them that are very good, some of them that are not very easy to interpret. So, but as I mentioned, there was no evidence for a difference in executive functions in elderly people, mixed results for adults, and a bilingual advantage for children. Kind of similar to the studies abroad. And this study, that was a data collection that we did, it involved highly proficient Arabic-Portuguese bilinguals, 77 of them, and they were from 2 different grades. And there was no relationship between bilingualism and executive control or selective attention for the younger grade, but for the older grade, they showed faster response times in a visual search task in 3 out of 4 of the conditions. Like, one of the conditions wasn't significant, but it was very close to significance. Was P equals 0.057 instead of 0.5. But yeah, and the variance, the associated variance, was from between 50% of the data variation explained by how proficient you are, and 19% of the variation explained by how proficient you are. Now going back to cognitive reserve, due to neuroplasticity, life experiences, and music playing, all the other things, juggling, yeah, like that, we can promote changes in our brains, even in adulthood, due to experience. And cognitive reserve tries to relate that with a protective effect in when you're older, either for dementia or for healthy aging. So it's kind of like you're more resilient. I brought these circles here just to explain it better. Picture that this one here, it has no cognitive reserve, and this one has cognitive reserve. And the arrow here, the mouse arrow here, is like a disease. When it gets to this person here that has no cognitive reserve, it's gonna affect them directly. And as soon as they start having atrophy, and soon after they start it, they are gonna have like some kind of functional differences or functional loss. But when you have cognitive reserve, have some kind of cognitive reserve, you're gonna have the disease can start, and atrophy can go on for a while before it gets to a point where you start having functional problems. So it's kind of like a protection layer from disease, neurodegenerative disease and healthy aging as well. And in healthy aging, I came here to present here very shortly an fMRI study that assessed different regions of the brain, and they showed that bilinguals had more preserved connections in the parietal frontal regions. And I don't think I mentioned, but yeah, the frontal lobe is related to the declarative skills when you have to evoke declarative memory, and is activated when you are not that fluent. And the parietal lobe is activated mostly when you're not that fluent, but it never gets to a point that's completely procedural, so there's always some frontal activation. And the parietal lobe is related to exposition and vocabulary in a second language. So it makes sense that it's these connections that are preserved. And going to dementia, there are multiple studies that found that bilingualism can promote this effect of cognitive reserve. These studies found that these results either for Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment of single domain. But these evidence were usually from the age of diagnosis, or if you have like the same age of diagnosis, the level of functionality, and usually some kind of way that tries to relate higher atrophy to lower symptoms, to lower disease progression. Like you have had more disease, but you kept your functionality, so you have some kind of reserve there. And for Parkinson's disease and multiple domain mild cognitive impairment, I wrote mild here, sorry, it's actually mild cognitive impairment, just like here. There is no evidence from what I have read. So we really need to understand a little bit better under which conditions does bilingualism promote this cognitive reserve. Because there are some studies that find it, some studies that don't. Most studies do find it, but some studies don't. And like which specific kinds of dementia, in which conditions, like is 10 years enough? Is 15 years enough? Like if I stop speaking, how many years does it take for me to lose this reserve? Or do I ever lose it? There are some questions that we still don't have an answer to. And also the relation between Parkinson's disease and multiple domain mild cognitive impairment. If there is really no effect, and if so, why? In which conditions there is an effect, if there is, for example. I guess especially Parkinson's. I'm working on it myself, the relation between bilingualism and Parkinson's disease. But yeah, Parkinson's affects the basal ganglia, and as I mentioned, we have some increase, some volumetric increase in bilinguals, exactly in that area. So maybe there's something there that we didn't really study. Because there was actually only one study in Parkinson's disease, and one study that was published as a paper, and it was from Hindle and Bialystok. I don't remember the other authors. And there was actually another one, but it was only an abstract published in the United States last year, that they claimed that it was only for Parkinson's disease associated with dementia, but not with no association to dementia. But yeah, only 2 studies is too little. We really need to dig more into that. Also verify which languages are better assessed by which questionnaires, because of course, I guess even when presenting these questionnaires, they do studies like that. Usually, when you self-assess your language skills, people usually don't lie a lot. They usually give kind of appropriate answers. But it's not like a perfect correlation, but it's kind of like that. But maybe some languages have differences between the others. Even I once heard it in the Aristotle lab that some languages actually have the effect of being underrepresented in the questionnaire, and others overrepresented. Like some people are more proud than others about their heritage languages, and this might influence how much they are going to tell you that they are fluent. And I guess that's it. These are my references. And if you want to contact me, you can just use this email. So bye bye, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next time.